Liz Cheney, the former Congresswoman and Vice Chair of the January 6th Committee, speaking out in a new book. She is back in the news as one of her former colleagues in Congress is pushing today for what he calls probing the Jan 6 probe, while another, ousted Speaker McCarthy, says he's leaving Congress. There's also today new indictments related to Trump's fraudulent electors plot in a new state, Nevada. So we're going to get to all that tonight with Ms. Cheney, drawing on her experience and the position she took as the only member of then Republican leadership and one of only 10 House Republicans to ultimately cast an impeachment vote over that insurrection. Cheney, of course, key to the bipartisan Jan 6 committee, which was deemed by independent experts as one of the most effective congressional probes in our modern era. I'm sure you remember some, if not all, of these evidentiary hearings. Cheney drawing on her government experience to navigate the clashes over evidence, testimony, how to get and then tell and convey a full accounting of what was Donald Trump's multi-part conspiracy. And I'll tell you this as well tonight. In an era where so many people ask whether facts still even matter, we know the committee's work actually reached tens of millions of Americans presenting the evidence, the testimony at those hearings. And we have indications that they impacted some prosecutors' pursuit of justice here. They led also to two precedent-making convictions of Trump aides who tried and basically failed legally to defy those investigative and lawful congressional subpoenas. All of this provided new evidence that impacted many cases, from holding Fox News accountable for documented defamation and lies to fortifying the factual case for Donald Trump's coup indictment. The former president, legally presumed innocent, but faces a lot of evidence in that March trial. And Cheney, in the book here, tracks the road to those results in Oath and Honor. There's a front row seat, which she uses to tell the story, harrowing at times, depressing at times, but with a project left for Americans to consider what we all do as members of this society, documenting that multi-part conspiracy and including specifically information on the now indicted fraudulent electors plot.
Today, an alternate slate of electors in the contested states is going to vote, and we're going to send those results up to Congress.
Something that Rudy and the team have worked on. The Trump slate of electors are showing up today in the state capitals.
We fought to see the electors. The Trump campaign asked us to do that.
There has been an alternate slate of electors voted upon that Congress will decide in January.
Yes, I was part of the process to make sure there were alternate electors.
There you have some of it. Stealing an election through fraud is a crime. It's a crime apart from what then became the separate violent insurrection. And the questions about whether Donald Trump legally met the bar for inciting that plot, which was one of several. In the book, we learn how 2 days before that insurrection, Cheney recounts listening to a private call of Trump lawyers and backers pushing the plan to use fraudulent false electors as a means to claim, to lie, and claim there were, quote, dueling states of electors heading into the certification. Now convicted Trump campaign lawyer Jenna Ellis saying out loud, quote, this was a plan to obstruct or delay the lawful counting of electoral votes, Cheney writes. And she knew that was a straightforward, unambiguous example of criminal conduct.
Remaining silent and ignoring the lie emboldens the liar. I will not participate in that. I will not sit back and watch in silence while others lead our party down a path that abandons the rule of law and joins the former president's crusade to undermine our democracy.
Liz Cheney speaking out on the House floor, and she is our special guest live right now, former Congresswoman and Vice Chair of the January 6th Committee. Welcome. Much to get to.
Thank you. Great
Appreciate
to be here.
You being here.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the coverage that you all have done, that you've done so clearly and completely of what is, I think, the most important issue of our time.
Appreciate that. And, of course, this is one of those things where our viewers, news viewers, have been watching those hearings, covering them, and now we're here together to discuss it. I showed the elector plot, which you write about. Why was it important to document that, and how did you experience that first as a Republican insider? Talk about being a witness. You just detail being on that call and saying, oh, this is not acceptable going into the 6th.
Well, I think the way that you laid it out is so important. There had been talk that you know, and Stephen Miller had appeared in December. You've got Steve Bannon there. There had been some talk that these electors, these fake electors, were going to meet in the states. But it wasn't until this call on January 4th, and I was on an email list. I don't know how long that email list, how large it was, but it was a list that went out to so-called surrogates for the campaign, but probably had just not taken me off of the list. And so when I got the email on the 3rd announcing this call, I thought, I'm going to dial in so I can understand exactly what they're talking about. They said this would be plans for January 6th, and it was on that call that I understood for the first time this description given by both Jenna Ellis and Jason Miller that the fake electors were, in fact, going to be the basis for Vice President Pence to refuse to count the legitimate electors. And that link and that connection, as you can imagine, was chilling. And after I listened to them lay out this plan, understood what it meant, I went immediately into the Capitol to talk to the House parliamentarian, who is sort of the guru of the rules of the House, to understand, what do we do? And the answer was, there's not that much you can do. You need to work with the Senate. You probably need to make a motion to adjourn. But it was a moment that was really just, in some ways, terrifying to recognize this is the plan, this is the plot, this is what they intend to do. And I learned later, of course, that Vice President Pence and his counsel were almost at the same time, I think maybe the day before, speaking to the House parliamentarian and the Senate parliamentarian about the fact that Vice President Pence was not going to refuse to count the electors. But, of course, we didn't know that at the time.
And a point that comes through in your work, the book, and the committee's report is that while the violence is horrific, it has now been a convicted sedition, and we've dealt with that partly as a country. These potentially non-violent criminal plots could have also functioned. Some of them may have gotten further with a few different people in charge without the violence. You write that Jenna Ellis, for example, had examples, quote, of what Pence might say, that he could refuse to just count any votes. Yeah. And then you would have the appearance for television, for the internet, the appearance of something contested when, in fact, it was just being slowly stolen.
Well, and there was, as you know, absolutely no legal basis. We had certified legitimate electors from all 50 states, and the fact that, the Trump campaign, and as we've now seen, I think in 3 states, there have been indictments for those fake electors themselves. So it was a key part of the overall plan. You actually have shown on your show several times the chart that shows the different elements and the different time frame in terms of the
conspiracy arrow. So we'll put that up. This is the original. I didn't know you were going to bring it up, but there it is. And we, in our reporting here, take pains to emphasize that however silly a lawsuit, it's not a crime. People can file all kinds of lawsuits. These have now been indicted, where you see the electors plot, for example, as well as others, have been indicted at the state and federal level because they crossed over. With this in mind, since you bring it up, what is important for people to understand as we get ready for both Trump's federal trial and an election where these are live issues?
Well, there's several things that are just fundamentally important about this chart. I would say the first one is, as you say, a candidate has the right to go to court if they believe that there's been fraud in an election. They have a right to challenge it. But what Donald Trump did was ignored the rulings of the courts. He lost 61 out of 62 of these lawsuits. And that is really important for people to recognize what he will do if he's elected again, as a president who will not abide by the rulings of the courts. But what we understood, one of the biggest sort of eye-opening things for me about our work on the Select Committee was the multi-part plan, and understanding that, there was this plan to pressure the state legislators, to pressure the vice president, to use the Justice Department corruptly to put this plan in place, to pressure the vice president. And all of those things were part of this effort to overturn the election and to seize power. And, of course, the violence itself, refusing to stop the violence, refusing to tell the mob to go home, sending the mob to the Capitol when he knew they were armed, as we demonstrated in the hearings. All of that is part of this illegal, unconstitutional plan that Donald Trump oversaw to do something no American president has ever done, to seize power.
And you talk about what no other president has done. He is now at times telegraphing or normalizing vows of revenge, We saw that both, again, against you, former Vice President Pence, and others, taking officials who, by the way, happen to be long-term Republicans, but even put that aside, trafficking in intimidation, menacing, potential violence, appeals to violence, talking about a dictatorship, talking about going after the press.
Right.
These are things that we know, and you have a background, and your family has a background in foreign policy. We know what that playbook looks like. Here he was, just, I'm going to show this briefly, talking about the kind of day one dictator he might be.
We love this guy. He says, "You're not going to be a dictator, are you?" I said, "No, no, no, other than day one. We're closing the border, and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator."
Your response?
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, Sean Hannity, who was conducting that interview, Sean knew at the time, we, have the text messages between Sean and Kayleigh McEnany on January 7th. They understood how dangerous Donald Trump was after January 6th. They were trying to isolate him. They were trying to land the plane. They knew the country was in danger and that Donald Trump was the source of that danger. And Sean Hannity knows that today. So he has several times now tried to sort of bail Donald Trump out when he's said something or suggested something that is illegal, that is completely beyond the bounds. And he did it again last night. And, of course, Donald Trump won't deny that he has plans like the ones we've been discussing. He says it on a weekly, if not a daily basis. And I think what we as Americans and as voters, as citizens need to commit to do is not to become numb to that. What he says is so outrageous that it can be very easy for his allies to say to the rest of us, "Oh, come on, that's not true." What the lesson of Donald Trump of the last several years has taught us is we have to take him seriously and we have to take him literally. And he has shown us what he's willing to do.
And the Justice Department did not seem eager to take him literally or look at him as a potential suspect. That's the criminal definition initially. Do you think he would have been ultimately charged without the January 6th committee's work?
I think that our work was critical. I think the Justice Department was obviously very focused in a very important way on prosecuting those who had actually, invaded the Capitol that day. But I think that the work that we did, I think that the opinion by Judge Carter, which was a result of the Select Committee's efforts to get access to John Eastman's emails, and Judge Carter's ruling that it was more likely than not that Donald Trump and John Eastman had violated at least two federal statutes. I think that all of those things clearly contributed, and I hope very much led the way. And I think you can see it in the indictment and the way that the plan that we've been talking about is laid out in ways that are very similar to the things that we found. It's not a surprise. Those are the facts. That's the evidence. But it's really important for the future of the country that Donald Trump be held accountable, that everyone who was involved and engaged in this be held accountable.
Have you spoken to Jack Smith or his team?
I have not.
When you look at the case they're building, given that you are what we would now call a subject matter expert, among other things, what do you think factually and legally is important to convey? You brought up the charts and the arrows. The report that you helped author talks about a 7-part process. And yet you and I think we all know, you can't throw everything at a jury and say, just look at all this mess. What do you think must be conveyed clearly and factually?
Look, I think that from what I've seen, from what I've read, from the work that they've done to date, they're doing a very effective job. I think the focus that they've had on Donald Trump's intent is very important. One of the things we did in the Select Committee report was make sure that we'd put together a chart that showed with specificity the claims that he was making, the times when he was told those claims were false, and the dates, and then afterwards when he went out and made them anyway. So there's no question that he was saying things that he knew to be false in furtherance of his efforts to overturn the election.
Looking a little bit at again, what we experienced here, we have your exchange with Meadows and aide Hutchinson and sort of where all that goes. I want to play a little bit of that.
Is it your understanding that President Trump asked Mark Meadows to speak with Roger Stone and General Flynn on January 5th?
That's correct. That is my understanding.
And Ms. Hutchinson, is it your understanding that Mr. Meadows called Mr. Stone on the 5th?
I'm under the impression that Mr. Meadows did complete both a call to Mr. Stone and General Flynn the evening of the 5th?
We reported on that, as well as other footage that's come to light about Roger Stone. He definitely seemed to be around and aware of the idea that things could go to a different level. He also had contacts, as you know, and have demonstrated with the militias. I want to say, in fairness, he has publicly denied what Ms. Hutchison testified to under oath. He denied that in public, not under oath. Do you still believe her version of events? What more do you know about Mr. Stone, who has evaded any real legal consequence for this?
Yeah, we focused in the report very intently. We included a section on the credibility of witnesses and thought that was crucially important because witnesses like Cassidy Hutchinson, Sarah Matthews, Matt Pottinger, Pat Cipollone, one of the reasons Cassidy was so important was because before she testified, Pat Cipollone had not been willing to engage with the committee, and we issued a subpoena immediately afterwards, and he did engage, and that his testimony corroborated hers was very important. But so I have complete confidence and gratitude and respect for her courage for what she did, as well as for other witnesses who, at great personal risk, told the American people the truth, told the American people what they knew. With respect to people like Roger Stone, Mike Flynn, there's, first of all, video and photographic evidence of both of them with members of the militias, as well as the fact that they took the fifth when they appeared in front of the committee. And one of the things we also know is that Jack Smith has tools the committee did not have in order to get to the truth. But one of the most chilling moments for me of many during this process was when I asked General Flynn if he believed in the peaceful transfer of power in the United States of America, and he took the fifth.
And just to spell that out, the implication is he's taking the Fifth Amendment because the answer that might support violently overthrowing the government would be, to him, a type of confession.
Right, that it could incriminate him.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's quite striking. I wanted to look a little bit at the process. We have something here prepared, just a little bit of, again, archival material. The January 6th committee, of course, ended with the last Congress, but since then there have been actually these two criminal trials of Trump aides who tried to defy it. I want to turn to that now, and then we'll bring, of course, Ms. Cheney back in. I'm talking about how the committee, Ms. Cheney and her colleagues, voted to take what is a relatively rare step of holding Mr. Bannon and Navarro in contempt in that subpoena clash. And just to remind everyone, the committee first demanded Navarro's testimony after he detailed his role in plots to overthrow the election, including on this program.
We had over 100 congressmen and senators on Capitol Hill ready to implement the sweep. The remedy was for Vice President Pence, as the quarterback in the Green Bay sweep, to remand those votes back to the 6 battleground states.
Do you realize you are describing a coup?
No.
Navarro's discussion of what he called that sweep plot did draw interest. He claimed he viewed his testimony as privileged, even though he was making public statements. Now, after defying the January 6th committee's subpoena, the committee held him in contempt. I want to show Ms. Cheney what you said briefly as vice chair at the contempt hearing for Mr. Navarro.
Mr. Navarro is also a key witness. He's written a book boasting about his role in planning and coordinating the activity of January 6th, and yet he does not have the courage to testify here. We have many questions for Mr. Navarro, including about his communications with Roger Stone and Steve Bannon regarding the planning for January 6th.
Navarro did not answer those questions to Congress. Both of those defendants have since been convicted and sentenced to jail. They are currently out free while they appeal those convictions. Mr. Meadows was not indicted by DOJ after being held in contempt. In the book, Cheney writes, she found that difficult to understand. The update all the way up to now, Meadows does await a RICO trial in Georgia amidst reports that he is cooperating with Jack Smith's federal coup case. And so, Ms. Cheney, we look at all of that. What do you see as the lessons, both in the committee being assertive and vindicated? As those are independent judges, independent juries that ultimately agreed with what you held in the case of Bannon and Navarro. And what about Mr. Meadows?
Well, in terms of the process, it was fundamentally important from the beginning of the committee that we engaged in an aggressive litigation strategy, that we ensured that our subpoenas would be enforced. And it was, one of the things we learned was it didn't matter whether judges had been appointed by Democrats or Republicans. I think this is one of the things we're still seeing today, almost without exception, that members of the judiciary recognize and understand the threat that we're facing. And what we saw with respect to the committee was that they moved quickly, that they acted in ways that recognized very clearly the impact and import of the committee's work, that we needed access to this information. So the process itself, I think, was very important. With respect to Mr. Meadows, we were hearing from the staff on the committee that they expected that he, in fact, would be indicted. When he wasn't, it was a surprise. And it was a surprise in particular because the Justice Department did not, in fact, assert the kind of complete blanket immunity that Meadows himself had been claiming. They said, in fact, that, a former chief of staff is not entitled to that sort of complete immunity. So that made it even more curious why they actually hadn't moved to indict. And I think at the time, we thought that it might be because he was cooperating. I think that's still possible. We don't know for sure. But
possible, but not confirmed in your mind that whether he's cooperating fully with Jack Smith.
We don't know that.
You look at what they're preparing in Georgia. The reporting today is they want Barr to testify, Rosen and Donahue, you had, of course, put scrutiny on there, Mr. Bannon, who we just mentioned, and Pence as a star witness. First, any reaction to this reporting? Does that track with what you would understand to be the right way to make the case? Do you think Pence would be a strong witness in Georgia or the Jack Smith case?
I think what that list shows is what we saw on the committee, what we demonstrated on the committee was that the people that know this story, the people that, in fact, were the subject of pressure from Donald Trump, the people that tried to stop him, people that have the evidence are Republicans. And so people who say, for example, that what the committee was doing was somehow partisan really overlooked the fact that our witnesses were, in fact, almost entirely Republicans. So that list doesn't surprise me at all.
And then with regard to Georgia, Jim Jordan, who you know well and have clashed with, is saying today that, A, he wants to lead an investigation into your committee's work, and B, specifically, and again, I want to be precise about this, he is, without much evidence, sort of suggesting that somehow there would be contact between the committee and the Georgia RICO prosecution's office that somehow bears scrutiny or is bad, that there's a problem there. Your response?
Look, I think that we have seen Jim Jordan do everything he can to try to cover up what happened on January 6th, to try to divert attention from the facts of that day. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the extent to which he's been very confused himself when he's had to answer the question about when did you talk to Donald Trump that day? What was your role in that? I think people should go back and take the time. It's only a few minutes, but take the time to watch Jim Jordan's exchange with Jim McGovern, who was then chair of the Rules Committee when we were actually in the process of holding Bannon in contempt. But as McGovern questioned Jim Jordan, and then Tom Cole as well, questioned Jim Jordan about the communications he had with Donald Trump, Jordan has never given a straight answer about that. So I think that he's going to do everything he can to try to protect Donald Trump, to try to cover up. He has a lot to hide. And I think that he owes the American people answers.
Another former colleague of yours, now former Speaker McCarthy, making news today that he will not run for Congress again. Want to give you the floor for any response to that, but I want to ask you something that when we all try to make sense of this on the outside, your book talks about risk and standing up for something. And I think people are familiar with the risk that you and others have taken. And because of the climate we're in, some of that risk is quite serious. It's physical security risk to your life and family. But even career risk, which many people spend decades. If you go to hang out in Washington, some people have spent the better part of their adult lives trying to get this job, and they don't really want to do anything to risk it. What does it tell you, even by that narrow margin? I'm curious, Ms. Cheney, that you and former Speaker McCarthy took different approaches here. Both of you have paid consequences, which we could explore, but it does not seem that Kevin McCarthy's documented, I would say, I don't know how you would put it, craven efforts to be on both sides of this at all times and then cozy back up to Trump and MAGA. It doesn't seem that even by the narrow margin of careerism that saved his job.
Well, and I think it's a really fundamentally important lesson for everybody to learn watching this period of time, which is that leaders matter and decisions that individual leaders make matters. And so, you know, the story of Kevin McCarthy is throughout this period, he had multiple opportunities to do the right thing, and each time he did the wrong thing. And it isn't just that it has now cost him his career in terms of losing the speakership ultimately at the hands of Trump, being abandoned by Trump. But it's that it cost the nation greatly that the leader of the Republicans in the House didn't lead, didn't say, you know what, I'm going to stand up and do the right thing. We aren't going to object to electoral votes. I'm not, you know, he was in the right place in the days just after January 6th. But because the financial campaign contributions dried up, corporations said they wouldn't give to Republicans after the insurrection. You know, he then went down to Mar-a-Lago. He needed Donald Trump. He needed Donald Trump's donors. And that meant he had to help Donald Trump wipe away the stain of what he's done to our country.
We spent a lot of time, as you mentioned, tracking the committee's work and the evidence. That's sort of where our head has been at, reporting on it. In reading the book, of course, there's a little more personal there. So we learn about you as a person. You chose to share some of that. We have one of the photos that you've chosen to share, but I think is interesting. Then President Ford, and I think we have you just there. You know, not everyone gets that kind of quality time with the president. Here you are with President Reagan, your father behind you. Much has been discussed about you and your father, the former vice president, but what we notice in the book is it goes back even further. And my question is partly about your own life personally, but also about here you are and the choices you made. Is I wonder, do you think in any way there was a positive that because you had more exposure and time, that in some way that may have given you an extra perspective or calcified your backbone? Is there something beyond you? You read about your father and President Bush, and that's been discussed. But seeing you there, let's put the Ford one back up because, you know, why not? But seeing you there, in a good way, I wonder, do you think that any of that time from such a young age made you more aware of the humanity of all these people involved and less cowed by it? Did it give you in some way something extra beyond all the other things we've heard about to stand up where so many other people apparently couldn't?
You know, I think that having spent time with Republican presidents, with Democratic presidents too, but certainly more with Republicans, having known people like President Ford, who was a good and decent and honorable man, and President Reagan and President Bush as well, both President Bushes, I know what presidents should be. And I know the kinds of presidents that we've had in the past, even if we disagreed on policy. And so to see Donald Trump do what he was willing to do, I do think that I found it, you know, absolutely beyond doubt that this can't stand. We as a nation can't stand for that. I don't know whether people with perhaps less experience, you know, I don't think there's any excuse. So
sure,
you know,
and I don't mean it that way.
Yeah, but I also think that when you look at where we found ourselves as a nation, and it was also the fact that my parents spent a huge amount of time with both my sister and me making sure we understood American history, teaching us about American history, teaching us about the Constitution, and so to me it was just obvious that we cannot survive as a nation if we have a president who's going to unravel the foundations of the republic.
Understood. The final three are what we call around here a lightning round. You're busy, so I don't know if you ever see when we do lightning rounds. We do.
I do.
Artists, musicians, but these are tailored towards you. And the first one is if you complete the sentence in, you know, a sentence or so, for you, the worst part of all this has been?
The worst part of all this has been the realization that my kids might grow up in a country where America doesn't know the peaceful transition of power, and that fear. But it also has been what has given me an absolute determination to do everything that I can do to make sure that doesn't happen.
The best part of all this has been?
The best part of all this has been just the incredible outreach and outpouring of support for the Constitution that I have seen, especially from young women around the country. It's been the lesson of the very courageous witnesses in our hearings. You know, people like Rusty Bowers, very, very moving to see people who, you know, supported Donald Trump, and then said, but wait a minute, I'm not going to violate my oath of office. And we had so many of those witnesses, but I would say in particular, the young women around the country that may not agree. We might not agree on a whole range of issues, but boy, they're willing to stand up and fight for our Constitution.
And finally, you've been elected to wield power. You've used power and decided where you stand. You risked your congressional seat. You're now a citizen, among other things. The final sentence is, regular citizens can and should do what right now?
Regular citizens in this country can never be bystanders. And right now, you've got to consider running for office yourselves, put your name on the ballot if you're going to uphold the Constitution, vote for good people, but most of all, come together across party lines to stop Donald Trump.